The talk today is on Washington, D.C. and the Pike years. So if you recall, last time, this is where we left off. We had just gotten through the Civil War, and Albert Pike had moved the headquarters from Charleston to Washington, D.C., and so I'm going to pick up right there where we left off and carry it through the end of Pike's lifetime journey. I know you all remember every word of my previous historical presentations. However, bear with me for a quick glance backward for some Masonic milestones to kind of put what we're going to say today in perspective. Masonry in the form that we know it today dates back to England and the early 1700s. This is the beginning of Blue Lodge Masonry. If we go back to the Builders Guilds of the Renaissance and the Knights of the Crusades and the Templars, our history dates back much further. But the truth of the matter, ritual style, Hiram-based organization actually began in the early 1700s. That's where we can base our starting point from. Almost immediately, people began, after the beginning of Blue Lodge Masonry, people began adding additional degrees. Particularly in France, as you'll recall, we talked about this, a number of higher degrees were produced. This was, there was no uniformity or organization put in place to perpetuate these higher degrees until a group representing the various factors met in Charleston, South Carolina in 1801, almost 100 years later from the beginning of basic masonry, and formed the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Even after that, there were other factions in the northern states who had some differing ideas, and they operated in a hostile and competitive atmosphere among themselves until 1867, when they finally consolidated and formed what we now recognize as the Northern Jurisdiction. My point in this mini history is to point out that the Charleston group, now called the Southern Jurisdiction, operated in a relatively peaceful atmosphere from the years 1801 until 1859. They expanded as the years went by into all of the new states which were created during these 58 years. However, this is the point of the whole lesson today. They really did not increase in membership as one would believe. The nationwide membership of the Southern Jurisdiction during these pre-Pike years, which was 1859 and before, never exceeded 500 members in a year. Notwithstanding periods in our nation's early years when there was strong anti-Masonic sentiment, basic Masonry did show much better growth than the Scottish Rite during those years. Scottish Rite, in the eyes of the Blue Lodge back in those times, was looked upon as a small, relatively inconsequential Masonic organization. I mentioned in my last talk that when Albert Pike took over, he found no written minutes or permanent record keeping. And that, to me, indicates that this was not a very strong organization. And it had been, even though it had been going, see, from 1801 to 1859, you know, what is that? That's 58 years. It still was not very strong and didn't have very many numbers. So Pike became Grand Commander in 1859, and in the next 2 years he began to institute some reforms, and then the Civil War began. So just like everything else in this country, for the next 4 years Scottish Rite was put on hold. When the war was over, most of the states represented by the Southern Jurisdiction were in shambles, economic shambles, and Pike was scrambling around himself trying to regain his citizenship. As you'll recall, we talked last time. So not much occurred until 1869 to 1870 years. At that time, Pike moved the headquarters to D.C., and this is where we left off, as I mentioned last month. So this is where we're beginning. Even though the headquarters had been moved to Washington, D.C., there was no headquarters building. The biennial meeting of the Supreme Council, held in 1870, was held in the city of Baltimore. At this meeting, Pike strongly recommended that the Secretary General move to Washington, D.C. And here's what this was the motivation that he wanted to throw out. He was going to offer a salary of $1,000 per year, plus 10% of the sale of all publications, in addition to the fees already established, which I was going to look this up and I forgot it, but already in place, the Secretary General was getting a certain percentage of the new members' renewal and the old member renewal. So, in other words, he was making his own money to run his own office, supposedly. Now, the Secretary General at that time was named Albert Mackey, and he had held that office since 1844. Now, Pike didn't even come into the Scottish Rite until 1853. So this guy, you know, had way a lot more seniority than Albert Pike did. And he was a highly respected Mason and a writer of many books on Masonry, but he was really a lousy handler of money and records. Horrible. Pike respected him as a Mason, but was so upset that he did not have access to membership numbers, candidates, or the income from the fees and dues collected. So here we have an organization, about 500 people, and you get no records. We have no membership records actually prior to 1880 even as to how many numbers they had at any particular year. And this was due to the fact that there was no communication whatsoever between the Secretary General and the Grand Commander. Now, Mackey, Pike was trying to lure him to come to Washington, D.C., where he'd have a better control. Mackey did not move, he did not resign, and he remained Secretary General until he died in 1881, which was quite a great frustration for Grand Commander Pike during all those years. Also in 1870, Pike addressed the honors program. This same year, that 1870, during that, is when he addressed the honors program to reward those who were deserving. The 33rd degree had already been established way back with the beginning of the Rite. However, Pike refined the requirements for the 33rd and listed the minimum age of 35. That was the first time they had a minimum age. He established also the Court of Honor, in which there was 2 ranks, KCCH and the Grand Cross. Also added was the fact that all 33rd degree designees should come from the ranks of the KCCH. Therefore, these honors all date back, these KCCH and Grand Cross anyway, date back to the year 1870. Pike's law practice continued to suffer. He found that D.C. was a tough place for a rebel or anyone affiliated with the Confederacy to practice law. Since he was spending most of his time with the Scottish Rite, he had financial problems for the rest of his life. In his words, the inadequacy of the purse. In 1874, the Supreme Council rented an office above the Republic Bank in downtown D.C. And 2 years later, Pike moved into the office as his residence. So he just lived there. There was nothing to indicate this, but I presume he just plain ran out of money and he moved in to where the office was, that was his living quarters. Let's see, in 1874, the Scottish, let's see, wait a minute, that's when they rented the office above the bank. During the next few years, Pike made 2 or 3 trips to the West Coast, particularly to the new state of California. Some of these tours would last between 3 and 6 months when he took off. Of course, transportation facilities weren't like we have today. And his presence on these tours actually sealed the fate of all Scottish Rite Masonry in the West, so as to remain in the southern jurisdiction, because at that time, I mentioned the northern jurisdiction had got their act together in 1867, and they were now trying to seek some of these new states as members that were coming into the Union, even though they had signed an agreement to stay within their 15 states in the northern area. But anyway, so we had competition, but Pike's presence seemed to have sealed the fate, and all those people stayed with the southern jurisdiction. Amazingly, after Secretary General Mackey died in 1881, the financial picture became brighter for the Scottish Rite, and in 1883, the Supreme Council authorized the purchase of its first building, the first house of the temple, and that's the building that I passed around here today. This was a 4-story brick structure with a basement located at the corner of 3rd and East Streets Northwest in Washington, D.C. The purchase price was $17,000. With remodeling costs and the addition of a library wing, the total cost came to $25,210. On Pike's next tour, he raised over $15,000, and the mortgage for this building was paid off in the following year of 1884. So the building belonged to the Scottish Rite, and it was mortgage-free. Pike then took up residence in this new building and lived there until he died 7 years later. Now, he mentioned that he was happy to leave the cramped quarters above the bank building and move into the spacious quarters of the new building. So I guess he was happy in that regard. In the spring of 1884, a bombshell hit the Masonic world. Pope Leo XIII lambasted Masonry in the world, and particularly in America, because America was where most of the Masonic growth was. Previous popes had denounced Masonry, but not with the fervor and vengeance and in such a continued manner as this pope. This long-time feud between Catholicism and Masonry, if properly explored, would require a heck of a lot more than just one session of like what we have here tonight. So, because the subject matter itself is very deep, and there's a whole lot to it, and I certainly am not qualified to go in and to give a complete report on that. But since it falls in the chronology of these years that we're trying to cover, I will just give you a state a few facts in regard to this feud, I guess you would call it. With the American Revolution, closely followed by the French Revolution in the late 1700s, there were nations being formed with democratic principles. Now, democracy promoted such new ideas as the separation of church and state, freedom of worship, the right of free speech, and probably the main thorn in the side of the Catholic people was the free public education under state supervision at that time. Now, let me contrast that with what the Catholic perspective was. They were accustomed through all these years of history of having a monarch, a king, an emperor, or somebody like that, who most of the time was a Catholic. And then they would just say Catholicism is the state religion, and everything else is illegal. And this is what Catholic people wanted. They felt that, you know, this gave them some strength, and the new democracies didn't allow for that. And so this is where really the rift is. Now, Masonry, of course, supported all of these freedoms that we just mentioned. Rather than attack these new emerging democracies, the United States and so forth, the Catholic Church attacked Masonry as a religious sect who endorsed these ideas. Probably hatred of the old organizations of the old builders' guilds and the Templars from centuries before had something to do with why their focus and their wrath was wreaked on the Masonic fraternity. The Masonic leadership was stunned, but the man who was never at a loss for words, Albert Pike, was the person who responded, not in the name of the Scottish Rite, but in the name of Masonry in general. And of course, I don't have time to go through all of his long response to the charges of the Catholic Church, but in paraphrasing, just let me boil it down to a sentence or two. He said that Masonry has never attacked religion in general or Catholicism in particular, and never will. We only want to defend ourselves and our principles. And then he goes on and does so in a very eloquent manner. Pike's response became the official Masonic reply for the whole country to the Vatican. The Catholic Church maintained that in the public education, Protestantism was creeping into the classrooms in the United States. And if you think about it, that was probably true. That probably was true. So the outgrowth of all of this was that the emphasis of the Catholic Church on building schools, colleges, and universities became very strong. This became the era of the greatest growth of Catholic schools in the United States, this period of 1880s to the 1920s. After the 1920s, with democratic countries springing up all over the world, most of the Catholic charges were now moot. The rhetoric has subsided, but now 125 years later, the relationship between Masonry and Catholicism remains uncertain. During the 20th century, both sides faced a mutual foe, communism. However, this did not provide grounds for a better relationship. The Catholic Church certainly hated communism because they didn't allow for any kind of religion. And of course, with no freedom at all involved, the Masonry was definitely against communism. But they didn't use that mutual foe as common grounds to go together and to try to fight it. There was too much animosity. The wounds incurred here in the 1880s seem still to be remembered. Amazingly, we, the Masonic organization, received the wounds, but they are the ones who still hold the grudge. Because Pike mentioned in his deal, the Catholics are open to our organization. We have not closed it off. They're the ones that actually have closed the doors to membership in the Masonry. Moving on now, in 1885, Pike set out on another Western U.S. tour, and he became ill twice and finally had to return home to D.C. From that point, his health continued to slowly deteriorate, and he died in 1891. He was an extraordinary man in so many ways, absolute genius, and yet in a few ways he was so average or even less than average. One of his weaknesses, of course we've already pointed out, was his lack of respect for money and the handling of finances, both personal and organizational wise. He suffered with an inefficient Secretary General for 22 years, and then when he died, he appointed a replacement whose name was Ireland. But Brother Ireland did well for his first year or year and a half, and Pike was ecstatic. He was getting the records he wanted, he was getting the money information, so forth, and then guess what? Ireland fell into the same pattern of his predecessor, and Pike got no more information through 1888. And so he basically, for his 32 years as Grand Commander, did not have the benefit of up-to-date information on and proper collection of monies for all of the time he was the Grand Commander. Got about 5 minutes more. Pike has to be respected as the savior of Scottish Rite Masonry in the United States. He molded it into what he wanted it to be, and that was the University of Masonry. He often said that the Scottish Rite was for the intellectual and scholarly elite of the fraternity. He was satisfied with the modest growth, and he actually put down those who wished to accelerate its membership. That was not important to him, how many numbers we had. He just wanted well-qualified Scottish Rite Masons. And you recall, of course, from a previous talk, that he would not allow the theater type of degree presentation. That was one of his precepts that he felt cheapened the transfer of knowledge to the members. Okay, let me close with these statistics, because membership seems to be the thing that's running through this whole talk today. Membership of the Southern Jurisdiction. As I mentioned, we have no actual numbers available before 1880. We just know the approximate numbers, and that there was probably less than 500 in any one year. So I've taken the years, about 10 years before Pike died and 10 years after he died, and you can draw your own conclusions. In 1880, the Scottish Rite in the United States had 1,150 members. In 1885, 5 years later, they had 1,519, about 400 plus improvement. 1890, they had ballooned up to 2,658. So, and then Pike died in 1891. So then 4 years after he died, our membership ballooned up to 5,819, more than doubled. 5 years later again, 1900, we doubled again, 10,570. And 5 years later, in 1905, we were up to 23,473. Now, you can draw your own conclusions. Was Pike the one who held the membership down because of his strong feeling of wanting every member to be well indoctrinated? Or was this just a time for Scottish Rite Masonry to blossom? We don't know. And what I'd love to have right here, and I want to get it sometime, is to compare these numbers of the Southern jurisdiction, who covered all of these states, 27 states at that time, and the Northern jurisdiction had only 15 states. But I'll bet you the Northern jurisdiction had just as many, if not more, members than the Southern jurisdiction did. Anyway, this is a quick glance of the Washington years under Pike. The facts came from the book called The Lodge of the Double Eagle by William Fox. That's the book I'm using, and it's a great book, great reference book. The editorials came from yours truly. And that's it for tonight. Thank you.